I'm Alan Shreve, and you're listening to The Changelog.
Welcome back, everyone. This is The Changelog, and I'm your host, Adam Stacoviak. This is episode 210, and today Jared and I talked to Alan Shreve, the creator of the beloved ngrok. Everyone I know uses ngrok. We talked about what it is, why it exists, why he wrote it in Go, and ultimately why 1.0 is open source, but 2.0 is not. Our sponsors today are Rollbar and TopTal. Our first sponsor of the show is Rollbar. Rollbar puts errors in their place, full stack error tracking for all applications in any language. And I talked to Brian Rude, the CEO and co-founder of Rollbar, deeply about what Rollbar is, what problem it solves, and why you should use it. Take a listen.
How do you build software faster? Like, how do you build better software faster? And there are tons and tons of aspects to that. Like in Ruby is like, you can have a better language, you can have better frameworks that help you be more expressive and more productive. So the flip side of that is like, after you've built something that works, or at least mostly works, how do you like go about getting it from working to like in production and actually working? How do you cover the edge cases? How do you find things you missed? How do you iterate on it quickly? And that's kind of where what we're trying to do comes in. So we're trying to say, after you shift your software, you're not done. There's still work to do, and we want to help make that process of maintaining and polishing and keeping things running smoothly be really, really, really easy. So like, developers spend roughly half their time debugging, right? So anything we can do to make that process better is going to have a huge impact.
All right, that was Brian Ruse, CEO and co-founder of Rollbar, sharing with you exactly why it fits, why it works for you. Head to rollbar.com/changelog. You get the bootstrap plan for free for 90 days. That's basically 300,000 errors tracked totally for free. Give Rollbar a try today. Again, head over to rollbar.com/changelog. And now on to the show. All right, we're here today talking to Alan Shreve. Now, Alan, he's made this thing called ngrok and a bunch of other stuff. And Jared, we use ngrok every week when we ship Changelog Weekly.
That's right.
Where did this topic come from? Obviously, we use it, but where else?
That's basically where it came from. So I've been a fan of ngrok for a long time. There's lots of tools that do similar type things. This one seemed to be a cut above to certain degrees in certain ways, and just really appreciated it. Also noticed that, it's gone through multiple versions and used to be open source and isn't open source anymore. So thought, this could be an interesting story here.
Yeah. And we almost didn't have it on because of that.
Yeah, we had a little bit of a debate asked our members what they thought about it in terms of, is that an interesting thing or not? Which the consensus was, well, let's get Alan on and talk to him about it and find out what happened and see if it's interesting. So, Alan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the really nice intro. It's always a pleasure to hear about people who enjoy the software that I make.
So we'll obviously dive deep into ngrok, and like I said, we fire up ngrok at least once a week. I do personally to ship our weekly email. But one thing we like to do is figure out where our guests come from. So obviously, you've got a lot of interesting things happen around ngrok. You are a fan of Go, which we talked about our Go podcast called Go Time. But take us back further. Like, help us get to know who you are. What got you into software development?
It was kind of serendipitous how I got into software, actually. It started when I was going to high school, actually. Our high school had a requirement that you had to take one computer literacy class because, computers were the up and coming thing at the time, right?
Right, of course.
We wanted to prepare our students for the future. In addition to typing, of course, right? So you had your choice of a couple classes, and one of them was a class that was called it was essentially like how to use Microsoft Office. And so I actually picked that class because I figured it would be easy because I knew how to use Microsoft Office. And so I figured I would have to do no work to actually do that class. And my best friend at the time, when I told him that after I came out of the first class, he was like, what are you doing? You're wasting your time in that class. Come take programming with me. So yeah, I listened to him and joined the programming class and like instantly fell in love with it. So I really owe a lot of it to him.
It just seems like an unusual way to get into it. So obviously we all listen to our friends, but Microsoft Office? I mean, really?
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't the title of the class, like how to use Microsoft Office. It was like computer like business applications or something. Um, but I quickly realized what it was. The first class that I went into it, and they were like, create a PowerPoint presentation with 3 slides, something simple like that.
I gotcha. I can recall feeling cool putting Microsoft Office on my resume at one point in my life.
Really?
Oh yeah, of course. Like way back in the day when I had no understanding. Yeah, of course.
Right.
Yeah, proficient with Microsoft Office.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I could type in that thing hardcore. Good stuff.
So I went. So I had a little bit of a similar path in college. So I went into MIS, which is Management Information Systems, which is basically watered down computer science with some business stuff floated in there. So I very much had like the intro to Microsoft Office type of a course, and it was just the most boring, worst, just terriblest thing in history. So I'm curious to find out how you started from there, and then actually continued in towards writing software and not just switch careers at that point.
Oh, yeah, I guess I'm not sure if I explained it correctly, but basically I was in that class and my friend told me like you're wasting your time in that class, so I transferred out of it and into like a dedicated programming class instead.
Okay, I might have
to
missed
like
that.
satisfy the computer literacy requirement that we had in high school. And so it was in that programming class that I actually started to learn how to program on Turbo Pascal to start with, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Turbo Pascal.
What's the
Yeah.
difference
Have you
between
guys
that
ever
and
used it?
Pascal?
It's faster.
It's fast.
Hit the
It's
turbo button.
mode.
Yeah.
Have you guys ever used Turbo Pascal?
No.
No, Visual Basic, I think, was my intro, and then straight into Perl and open source from there. And a little C and C++.
Turbo Pascal is an interesting environment. It's really, really well suited to beginners because it basically it had like this really distinctive user interface too. It was just like this blue screen with yellow text for the code by default, at least. I never bothered to learn how to change it. So it felt very like, I don't know, I guess it felt very like 80s or 90s before my time, it felt, I guess. It was, yeah, so it was just this whole environment that like it was like a full screen mode by default. It wasn't like in a window or anything. So you're just kind of like immersed in the code. And then when you ran the code, there were like 2 options. One was like run the code and it would like print to like a console window, like what was coming out of standard out. And the other mode that it had was like a debug mode where it basically just fired immediately into a step through debugger with this like big yellow line or big, I don't remember what color it was, that highlighted the line of code that was executing. And it would just step through the whole program for you, which as a beginner, like having to never like learn any, like I didn't have to worry about source control or have to learn how to organize a project or have to learn what a compiler was. Like it was just a full environment where there was a run button and a debug button, which was just, it was really great to start out with.
Take us from there to Go and ngrok.
Oh man, there's a lot of stuff in between that.
Well, hit the highlights.
Yeah, I mean, I finished doing the programming course in high school. I eventually, like after I learned Pascal, I learned C, and then a kind of a working the most basic knowledge of C++. Not how to use it well, of course, but like how to define a class and stuff like that. I kind of actually lost track of programming for a couple years before I got an internship working at a local software firm My first job actually was interning for this local software firm that, no kidding, made Fortran compilers, and they still make Fortran compilers to this day.
Wow.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you're like, wow, someone still does that as like their only line of business. It's crazy. Yeah, so I started there. I actually wrote about it recently, when I was launching Equinox, but I originally started there as an intern where uh, I was actually packaging the software, which at that time meant like physically assembling boxes and like burning CDs and applying like printing
Yes.
CD labels and stuff like
Duplication,
that.
stuff like that.
Yeah, and yeah,
What was
Whole
it
different
about that?
idea
I
with
mean, you got
package
lost.
managers that we talk about today. Back then, it
Yeah.
was like some tape and some cardboard, right?
yeah, I was the package manager.
That's a whole different version of it for sure.
I know, right?
You said you got lost from programming. What happened to get you lost, and why did this internship pull you back?
Yeah, I got kind of lost because in between like finishing like the programming course and starting that job, which like in that job I eventually like transitioned to writing code for them instead of just packing boxes. Um, in between that, I had kind of outgrown what my instructor could teach me, and like resources on the internet for learning how to code and like going beyond what I'd learned weren't like nearly as good as they are today. I mean, they're fantastic today, but it was really a struggle to find. Uh, Not that there were no resources, but it was difficult to find like the next step. I always ended up finding things that were below my level or like way above it, and I couldn't find like materials that would get me like that like understood what I already knew and could push me like gently into new things. So that was actually kind of frustrating. So I kind of lost track of it for a couple of years while I was sorting that out. I remember I bought a book on uh, Visual C++, which was a horribly misnamed book. It was actually a book on how to write Win32 GDI applications. So I like made my own paint clone, but it like explained nothing about the underlying model of it. It was like, now you have to send a WM paint command. And I was like, okay, I'll type the the code to like send a WM paint command. I do not know why I'm doing this. Yeah, so that was like, it was just a very frustrating time.
So you still haven't gotten us back to Go now. So keep going.
Right.
We're
Yeah.
following the path. We've hit your internship. You're a manual package manager. You're getting back into software. Keep going.
So I actually started. I started writing code for that company, and then I went to college. I studied computer science at college, so I did a lot of programming during college, and it kind of took off from there. Yeah, I don't know. After like during college, I did a number of internships, like trying to find the kind of company that I wanted to work for. So I went through a couple companies. I interned for VMware and Microsoft and Fog Creek, and I ended up learning essentially that the ideal company that I wanted to work for was a company that was small. I didn't really enjoy like being part of the giant like corporate environment, but also one that was tackling like really difficult technical problems. So I was looking for some combination of small but very hard technical problems, which is not always easy to find. It's a lot easier to find now, but at the time it was not super easy to find.
So you interned at VMware and Fall Creek?
Yeah.
What was the kind of things you were working on at VMware? What year was that roughly?
VMware were I interned at VMware for 2 summers. Those were my first 2 years of college, and I was working on the QA team for what they called at the time Virtual Center, but has now been rebranded into something as part of vSphere. I honestly don't know because they've changed the branding so much.
Of course.
Yeah. So I was working doing QA for them, like building essentially like automated test harnesses, that kind of stuff. And then I did the next summer at Microsoft, where I got to work on the Windows 7 kernel. I actually like worked on the diagnosing like performance issues in the file system driver stack. And then I kind of transitioned away from that entirely, like interning at Fog Creek, where I actually helped them build the very first version of Kiln, which is like their GitHub equivalent for Mercurial hosting.
Yeah, I asked that because you said that you like small companies with difficult problems, and VMware's nothing like that, really. Maybe you were on a small team or something, but maybe you found out what you didn't like about a big company tackling, I guess, a hard problem too.
Yeah, I mean that intern, like going through those internships, was really like the learning experience that brought me to that like understanding. Before, I really didn't know what I would enjoy, but like doing all of those things was really helpful to like learn what it was that I was looking for.
Those are fairly well-known names too, like household names, so to speak, at least for us.
Sure.
You know, when it comes to an internship, I think I'm camping on these questions, and I know we're trying to get to your experience with Go and how you got there, but I'm thinking, like, for the listeners out there thinking, you know, I want to get established somewhere, maybe a similar path that you're taking. You know, these are household names, so to speak. You got an internship there. What was the process like, or how did you go about getting an internship? Was it just that easy from a college standpoint? Like, they made it accessible, or did you have to like, you know, kind of audition, so to speak? What was that like?
Yeah, I mean,
maybe how important that was. I guess you just said so, but how important that was to where you're at now.
It's hard to say, right? But I think certainly it was important for me. Like, I always felt like having those things on my resume was really valuable. As far as like how I got those internships, yeah, I mean, we had like career fairs at college, and like they would, you know, a bunch of companies would come and you would talk to them. It's so, I mean, like VMware had like a booth there that I went and talked to. Part of it, of course, you know, nothing is always that cut and dried. Like part of it was kind of that my friend's brother worked at VMware at the time. So I had an in there.
Nice.
And so he was, you know, able to help like take a chance on me, which I'm, you know, eternally grateful to him for.
It's who you know, sometimes, lots of times.
Yeah. And the other internships, I don't know. One of my friends interned at Microsoft one of the summers and was like, you should try it there. Like, I had a really good time. So that he like introduced me to those recruiters.
It's a good sales pitch. I'm going to try that.
Yeah, right. Fog Creek was the only one that I kind of went into blind, where I just applied blindly to them.
And they're like, probably the smallest team of those teams.
Sorry?
They're probably the smallest teams of those teams. Like, I mean, Microsoft's huge, VMware's huge. Twilio was small, now they're bigger.
Sure.
You know, that wasn't in your mention of internships, but it's on our list of where you've been before. But then Fall Creek seems to be, maybe they're getting larger now.
Sure.
Growing, obviously, but they started out, you know, a fairly small team.
Yeah, I think they were maybe like 30-ish people when I interned there. 30 or 40, something like that. Like applying for the internship there was pretty easy though, because I mean, like, I'm not saying that it was easy to get in, but as far as like doing all the right things, like Joel, I think, wrote up a blog post of like, if you want to intern at our company, you should do all of these things. So like I read like that, you know, blog post and did all of those things. And that was, you know, they definitely made it accessible. And I think a lot of companies are trying to follow that example, right? Like I've heard it's pretty commonplace for companies that you interview at these days to kind of provide you with This is what you expect when you come into the interview. Like, these are the kind of questions that we're going to ask. And I'm really in favor of that kind of attitude of like not just like taking candidates and bringing them in blind where they have no idea what to expect, but instead like taking candidates and saying like, we want to set you up to succeed.
We're coming up close to our first break, so we still haven't gotten to Golang. We still haven't gotten to really where open source fits into all this. So we obviously have to crack that nut open, but let's take a break real quick, hear from a sponsor. When we come back, we'll talk about maybe get a little closer to your path to Golang and then also how open source fits in. So we'll be right back. We love TopTal, and one of the interesting things about TopTal is being able to take control of your career, being able to work on technologies you want to work with, being able to work with companies you want to work with, choosing your own salary, being able to travel. And I talked to Asayal Arenas, the community manager for TopTal South America, and I was blown away by what this guy had to say, so take a listen.
To be tied to a desktop these days is something that definitely I think that people should, is not necessary for developers. If there are still developers, and I'm sure there are a lot of developers still tied to their desktops, I will let them know about Total, about this company that will give you like the opportunity to drive your own career. You know, you can decide how much time you want to work, how much you want to earn, where you want to work from, when you want to work. So what else? All that is possible.
All right, that was TopTal's community manager for South America, Asayal Arenas. He's living a dream. He's traveling the world. He's getting paid. He's doing what he wants. He's choosing his own path. And if that's what you want to do, call upon TopTal, TOPTAL.com. Tell them the Changelog sent you. If you want a personal introduction, email me, adam@changelog.com. And we're back from the break with Alan. We're talking about, I guess we're trying to get to the open source path here. Obviously, Jared and I mentioned ngrok, and that's an interesting project of yours, obviously, and you're a fan of Go. So where did your path to Go begin? At what point did you get to that? I know Go has been out for like, what, 6 years now, roughly? Somewhere around there. So at what point did you pick up Go?
I picked up Go towards the end of my time at Twilio, actually. Not that it actually had anything to do with Twilio at all. It's just
timing.
Where I was working at the time, yeah. I guess it kind of had a little bit to do with the work that I was doing at Twilio. I was working with my friend Jeff Lindsay there, and
we know Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff's a great guy.
We've had Jeff on the show before.
Yeah, he's awesome. And at the time, Jeff was really into asynchronous programming in Python. And we had a couple of services at Twilio that were written in Twisted Python. And Jeff was a big proponent for another asynchronous Python technology called gevent. And so I had started like building some stuff with that at Twilio. And when Go came out, I was kind of eyeing it, and I was like, this looks like it's the gevent model, but not a hack on top of some other language, that this is that programming model at the core of the design. And that really appealed to me. So that's kind of like what instantly got my interest about Go. Just to kind of expand on that, like the way that gevent works is basically it's built around, whereas like Twisted Python or Node are built around an event loop with callbacks when events happen. Gevent and similar technologies are built around the idea that the runtime should handle that for you. So you can basically spin up these things called green threads, user mode threads, that you would pretend like they were when you did I/O or any other kind of operation that would block the event loop normally. Instead of like having to manage that yourself, you would actually like make those calls as if they were blocking calls. but the runtime would be smart enough to realize that they were blocking calls and manage the event loop for you. So they would basically take that user mode thread that was about to block on a blocking call and put it on its own scheduler queue, and then stick an async IO event into the event loop that it managed. So it's, the very basic intro into how those technologies sort of work. And that was what gevent did, but it was like a hack on top of Python, right? Because Python wasn't built for that. So it did like really clever things like manipulating the Python stack frames and stack pointers to actually like do things like that. So when I saw Go, I was like, wow, this is like that model of like, we should just build our code as if like all of these threads are blocking, but the runtime should handle that complexity for us. So that was what got me into it.
It's nice when that's built right into the language as opposed to, implemented in a library or added on later.
Yeah, it allows you to do a lot of things better, right? When it's just built in at that core level, right? Gevent always had these problems where you would worry about every dependency you brought in, because if that dependency like did any kind of blocking IO, you had to worry like, did it actually block, or did like gevent manage to monkey patch those calls so that it wouldn't block, or did it do the IO in a C, like in C somewhere, so you couldn't deal with it at all, and you had like no visibility into these sorts of things, and it was a real pain. So Go having all of that built in was really awesome. Yeah. So I started building like a couple like just toy projects in Go to kind of fool around with it. And then at some point I actually decided that I wanted to learn to actually like build a substantial thing in it.
So was ngrok your big first substantial thing, or did you have some prior art?
Yeah, no, ngrok was the first thing. That's ngrok was originally a project built to learn Go. That was about it. One of the strategies, like the strategy that I really love for learning a new technology, is to take an existing project and port it into the new framework or the new technology or the new language or whatever it is that you're trying to learn exactly. So that's what I did with ngrok. The reason I like that is because when you build things, at least for me, I get all up in my head about what it is that I'm going to build, right? Suddenly it becomes like a product and I have to make product decisions where I was like, should it do this? Should it not do that? Whereas if you port something, all of those decisions are made for you. It becomes more like an academic, like a class project, where all of the requirements are defined up front. You like that entire cognitive load is gone. So that's ngrok was essentially that. It was a port of Jeff's tool, Local Tunnel, actually.
I recall talking about Local Tunnel actually back on 99, if I recall. We talked about Flynn, Tent, Local Tunnel. Yeah. That's really interesting. So was Local Tunnel in Python?
It was, yeah.
And so you were interested in obviously learning Go, but then porting something to it and making it a serious project.
Yeah, that kind of happened accidentally, really, that it turned into a serious project. It was really just a project to learn Go to start with. And Local Tunnel was a project that seemed like relatively small and well-contained and seemed, from what I knew, like a decent fit for Go because it was pretty network heavy. So yeah, I kind of picked it up and ran with it, and it just kind of spiraled out of that.
Were you surprised by the success of it? I mean, I know when it first came out, which I can recall back, it was probably like, I'm guessing at least 2.5, maybe 3 years is my guess, roughly, as far back as at least I knew about it. And it seemed like an obvious problem for a large amount of people. So did it seem like a surprise to you that it was successful?
Yeah, I guess it was surprising that it was successful because it was just a clone. That was kind of what surprised me about it actually taking off. Yeah, it was about 3 years ago now.
ngrok is so much cooler sounding than local tunnel. I mean,
I cannot begin to tell you how excited I was when I found a 5-letter pronounceable .com available. It was a beautiful moment.
yeah, and I'm just telling Jared in the back channel, like, I'm really interested in the name. Obviously, N stands for network, but why grok? I guess to understand the network.
The one thing that I did, like, as I after like I had cloned it and was happy with it, I like started to like think about other things that I would like in terms of the product, right? So I worked at Twilio, so I was dealing with webhooks all day. And when we built, so I built a lot of like Twilio applications for testing. And when you built a Twilio application, it was this really frustrating exercise because you would you would like write your code, and even with like local tunnel or ngrok or an SSH tunnel, you would pick up the phone and like dial a number or send a text message to actually like cause Twilio to call back to your code and trigger it to run. And that was so you do that once, but it was always broken, right? So it would break, and then you would try to fix it, and then you would do the same thing again. You would like pick up the phone. So I'd just end days with like a call log of like 40 calls to this one random number, just to like try to get the application working. And so I started like thinking about the kind of things that if I were working on that type of application, that would make it easier for me. And one of those was that I wanted to see all of the traffic that was flowing across the wire. That was really important, as well as being able to replay it. So yeah, like the introspection part of it was kind of new, and or wasn't, at least in any of the other tools. And I like the idea of like being able to introspect things and look at them as they're happening. So the name is kind of just a play on the word grok, coined by Heinlein, which is like to understand. And because there are a whole bunch of other like network tools that start with N, it's kind of a play on ngrep. It's weird. It doesn't actually mean that to me anymore. That was like the genesis of it, but to me, it just kind of is its own definition now.
I think what one thing about this tool that impressed me, there are a few things. First of all, you do a really good job of explaining its value proposition on the website. And so it's one of those tools that once you know you need something, you want to expose your local development environment to somebody who's not on your network, right? You need NAT traversal, you need all these things. You may not understand exactly how to get all that done, but you're like, man, I wish I could just give somebody a URL and they could actually access this demo that I have on my machine. You do a really good job of explaining like, hey, this is what that tool does. And so I think that was immediately impressive. And then the fact that it is just a single go binary, drop it into your path and it runs, which has been kind of a flagship feature of Go for a long time. It's just the easy distribution, makes for a good first experience. And then thirdly, there's a lot of like the little details that just are really nice. And I'll just give us a single example. And this might be ngrok 2.0 and it wasn't in 1.0, so you can help me sort that out. But for instance, when you're actually running the thing, it will, show you there's a little display in your terminal that shows the URLs and, like you said, do the introspection if you want it, what's going on. But there's even time where it detects an upgrade, and it like there's a new binary you can download, and it just says hit Control U to update itself. And so while you're running it, you just hit Control U, and there it goes out and downloads and upgrades itself. And you probably have to restart the program for it to run the new version. But little stuff like that you just don't expect from an open source project. And so I'm curious, like, where your attention to details come from, like why you put so much time and effort into this, and just like you to kind of just speak to that.
Yeah, the updating thing, I was really psyched about getting that working when I did.
It's really nice.
It went through a lot of iterations actually. There was an updating component to version 1 too. Sorry, version 1 as well. Uh, yeah, I don't know. Like as far as my strengths go in terms of like building things, I think of myself partly as a software engineer, and the other strength that I feel like I have is product design. And so a lot of that is just that attention to detail of just trying to round every sharp corner, um, constructing error messages that are helpful and useful. I'm still really not happy with the error messages that ngrok kicks out. I've kind of been on a mission lately where it's my goal to have every error message that ngrok issues have a unique code number that comes out of it, so that with like a unique prefix for ngrok, with the idea being that if there's any error that you should actually, it should be like a unique string that you can put into Google that will only point you at that particular issue. That way, like if someone like has that issue and tells me about it, that I'll know exactly what it is, or that I could like write up documentation for each one with like, this is what happened, right? Because you only have so much space inside of a terminal to actually like tell people what went wrong and how to fix it. But like to be able to like link to like walkthroughs and guides or possible like reasons that this sort of thing happened in documentation, that would be really easy to find with a unique code.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think I've seen a few projects starting to do stuff like that. I know Angular at some point started introducing kind of expansive, like their error messages would have, short URLs in it. And it's like, here's like the brief description of this thing, but in the console, like click here and it'll actually just expand out to a full page that has all sorts of extra information. And I think that's super useful. So have you been able to achieve the unique ID for every error yet, or is that an aspiration?
I'm getting closer. It's certainly not all the way there, but it's probably about half there.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. So I really love building product experiences that people love. And so a lot of the drive that I have in software is like to take really hard things and like solve them, but make them really accessible to people. Which is not, I don't know. There are a lot of projects that I use that I get very frustrated with because they do really cool things, but the user experience is often really poor with them. So I've always wanted to like, I always enjoy like making things like very polished and very nice. And the auto updating experience was definitely part of that for ngrok. I spent a lot of time like learning how other people did it and researching what would be the best ways to do it. And I still got all of those things wrong to start with, but I've been iteratively getting better at them. I recently actually just took all of that learning from building the auto update experience and kind of spun it out as its own product recently.
I think there's some lessons to be learned here. It doesn't just apply to open source, but for software development in general, especially when your target audience is developers, is when you sweat the details, it pays off, I think, in spades, because developers, probably more so than any other people, because we understand, what's happening. Like we understand what's going on when an auto update is occurring, or when this happens, and when you sweat those details, those little things that people may or may not even notice, really set pieces of software apart from the pack, even if they're serving the same purpose, because we appreciate the level of effort that goes into that, even if it's the value that it brings is minor. I'm not saying that an auto update is a minor value. I think that's a pretty big value, but just some of the little pieces of the polish on this software. Like you said, it was a clone, so it's definitely not a new idea. It's not a standalone product that nobody else is doing, and so it's like, wow, this is singularly valuable, but it works well, and it was crafted with care, and your audience is developers mostly or network people, and we tend to care about those things. So, a lot of success, frankly, in open source can be serendipity, right place, right time, those kind of things. Sometimes it is based on merit, sometimes it's not. But I think if you just sweat the details like you have, Alan, I think you're giving your particular tool a better shot.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really gratifying to hear, because I care a lot about the details. So I'm always glad when other people care about them as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good feeling.
On the note of success, I would actually probably say that because I have some sort of background knowledge on another project that could have been or probably was just as good, and I'm just saying that lightly. I don't mean that for sure, because there was a web service behind it, an installable client, things like that. But I had a friend, or I guess still have a friend. We just haven't talked in a while, but a friend who roughly around the same time ngrok came out had solved a problem like this, but wanted to make it a paid service, mainly because they wanted to do something similar like you. They wanted to do something serious that was outside of their normal job that could potentially grow some legs and do something interesting. But something about ngrok, I would say ngrok itself, but also the fact that it was open source. So I think my hat tip to you is I think that, and maybe you can agree, is that open source really was, or it being open source and being the way it was and so available to people that solved a great problem very, very well, like Jared's talking about, was a core underpinning to its success.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that a lot of people like open source for a number of different reasons.
Yeah.
But there are a number of people who will give you who just simply like it on principle. And so that's the only kind of software that they want to use. A lot of people like it for the hackability, right? That they can change things in it. And so being able to tap into those developers by making a project open source is a really powerful way to get adoption for anything that you're building.
I guess a side note too of the other project I mentioned is that that project right now is no longer. Oh, you win.
I'm sorry to hear that. It's not a competition.
I know that, but I mean, it's just
sad face.
It's a sad face, but I think it's interesting to at least for me, because I have a different perspective than you, because you didn't know this before me telling you this. But all along, I've been watching you two in parallel to a degree, and have seen you rise. And I imagine it's for the reasons we all know, that open source is easily adopted and it's easily contributed to, and you can go in and change it if you want. You can work hard and become a maintainer or become a contributor or whatever. And whereas a proprietary software that is, I guess, to a degree simple enough that should be open source, maybe even better as open source because it is infrastructure. Maybe I'm just trying to say that I think maybe open source was the better way to go, obviously. For somebody out there who may be thinking, should I close source this? But now you aren't really open source anymore, so that could be the flip. That could be the flip.
True. I think that's a perfect teaser for the next segment, which is that you built this tool, made it open source, huge success. I mean, even to this day, ngrok 1 has 7,000 stars on GitHub. Lots of people using it.
People even bake it into their products too, like their software. Right. Open source, fire up ngrok to do this. It's become a thing that people use daily.
That being said, I happily upgraded to ngrok 2 without even a thought, because I was happy user of ngrok 1. Yeah. So let's talk about that after this break. The switch, ngrok 2 closed source. What happened there? What was the decision? And all sorts of stuff around open versus closed after the break.
For those of you out there who are super fans, and I mean people who care about this show, listen every single week, care that we stay on the air, we want to invite you to join the membership community for just $20 a year, and we'll give you an all-access pass to everything we do, access to our members-only Slack room, exclusive discounts from our partners, 50% off in the Changelog store, and of course, you support us so we can support open source. Head to changelog.com/membership to learn more, and we appreciate your support.
All right, we are back with Alan Shreve talking about ngrok 1 versus ngrok 2, open versus closed, and what was probably a big decision to release ngrok 2 as a binary and keep the source to himself. So Alan, tell us about this decision, this change, where it came from and why you made it.
Yeah, it actually was not like a decision that I made at any one point in time. It was kind of an overarching decision that lasted for like a year as I was building ngrok 2, maybe a year and a half. It took a while to actually build that out. It's a really hard decision. It was a really hard decision. It still is. When I started building ngrok 2, the idea was like, I'm building it with like all of the source code just in a private repository. And then when I get towards launch, like I'll actually open source all of it. So part of that was that when I started building ngrok 2, I started building it in a more modular way, in a way that the intention was to take like a whole bunch of like different libraries and open source them. So that they like all of these individual libraries that were used to build ngrok 2 would actually be open source. And that actually happened. Like a lot of the technology that is used to build ngrok 2 is open source. The actual so like one of the projects that I built for this is a project called log15, which is like a structured logging package for Go, which allows you to build like reusable handlers and reusable handler structures. So that ended up being open source out of it. And then another piece was the actual like network layer that does stream multiplexing to actually run a whole bunch of connections over a whole bunch of virtual connections, really over a single TCP connection. That ended up being open source as well. That's a project called Muxadoo. That's on my GitHub as well. And both of those projects have been successful in one way or another, that they've been useful to other people, which I guess is a decent metric for success of a project. So like a lot of the stuff actually did end up being open source. The actual like product that was built on top of those libraries is kind of what didn't.
So it sounds like you've modularized the underlying infrastructure, kept that open source, and built what was before open source ngrok into, it sounds like potentially an actual product that people will pay for on top of the open source that made ngrok 1.
Yeah, that's it actually like wasn't built on top of version 1. It was essentially a complete rewrite. There's almost zero code that's shared across them, honestly.
Why the big rewrite instead of just continuing to evolve what you had?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically a result of a couple things. One was that ngrok was a project to learn Go, and when you're learning things, you make a lot of mistakes. There are a lot of things that you don't understand, a lot of things that you think you're smarter than other people who've been working on it for a while. So I made a lot of mistakes, a lot of things that, looking back on them, that I'm not proud of the way that it was built. And the other part was that the scope was changing. The scope for ngrok 2 was not this thing where there is a single like server binary that the ngrok client connects to, but I wanted to make it a very reliable service, right? One of the other pieces of quality from a product design that isn't so much UX that I care a lot about and put a lot of work into, and that you see very little of from like a user, is reliability and stability of the service. And so a lot of work goes into that. And one of the pieces that went into that was building out the server component in a way that it was distributed across many machines so that it could tolerate arbitrary machine failure. And these days, actually, I actually just released this last week, is that ngrok actually now operates in multiple regions around the world. So there are actually like HA setups in a number of different data centers that coordinate with each other to actually run a global ngrok service. And that's a very far cry away from there's one machine that runs the ngrok service.
Sure.
So actually like re-architecting it for that scope basically involved a complete rewrite.
So is it fair to say that the decision around this is financial?
Yeah, that's totally fair to say. There are, I was building it out, and one of it's mostly financial. There are some other things in it as well, but yeah, it's interesting. Like building a business model around open source is a tricky thing, and there are a couple ways that you can do it. Like there's the we do support model, right? Like we give away all the source, and then this runs some critical piece of your infrastructure, so you pay us essentially insurance is kind of what it is. The like if it breaks, you have a direct line to someone who can help you fix it.
Right.
There's also like the open core model, right, where you like give away most of it, but you charge, large amounts of money for enterprise features like, I don't know, single sign-on or something like that, audit trails.
Similar to how like a Sidekick is in that model where there's the open source community version and then there's Sidekick Pro, which okay, there's kind of there's derivations of that where you have kind of enterprise, which has enterprisey features, but Sidekick Pro is more like Sidekick plus plus. Seems like that model could have possibly worked for you. Did you battle around all these ideas as far as different ways of doing it, or did you throw your hands up in the air and say, "Well, I'm just going to keep it closed"?
Totally. The other model that was the one that I considered most seriously was the model that like Sentry takes and Docker as well, right? For Docker Hub at least, which is like all of the code is open source. There's nothing that's like a closed add-on, but we run the service for you, right? And so running the service is the piece that's like too complicated that you don't want to deal with, right? So you pay someone else to do it. So that was the one that I considered most seriously. And I ended up having problems with all of them. One of them was like the support model is based entirely around your product being core to like someone else's production infrastructure. That's like the thing that you pay insurance for. And ngrok right now is not that. It may be in the future, but at the moment, and certainly at the time, it was a development tool. And so if it breaks, like your developers are kind of unhappy, but it's not something where you're like, oh man, we need to have Alan on the line, at in 30 minutes notice to help us fix it if ngrok goes down. So that one was kind of out for ngrok, which was kind of validated because I never really got any, interest from people who were like, when it was open source, they were like, hey, can we pay you for support? And the other model that was seriously considered was like running it as a service. And it kind of, the trouble that I had with it was that it kind of put me at odds with making the product really great from a server standpoint. I feel like a lot of companies that have this like, well, you can run it yourself on your like, or you can use our hosted service, don't put a lot of work into usability when it comes to installation on your own service, right? Because they're not incentivized to. They're actually like financially incentivized to not make that good, right? So that you're more likely to be like, oh man, I don't want to stand up like RabbitMQ and a database and all of this other kind of stuff to like make this work. Let's just pay someone for it. And ngrok was kind of in this interesting place where it didn't really require a database. It didn't really require any infrastructure. It was just a binary, right? The server installation was such a simple thing that I put work into making it straightforward and really easy. And so there were, I had like talked with a lot of customers who were basically like, yeah, I mean, we could have paid you, but like we basically had no reason to. And part of that is part of like the reason that happens is partly because it was designed that way, but also like the product itself doesn't have any like persistent piece, right? It doesn't like store your requests on the server or do any of those other kind of things that require more complicated infrastructure like a database or a message queue or those kind of things. So I wasn't particularly happy with either of those options. And so when I launched it, it was kind of launched in a mode of, well, I'll keep the source close for now, and like we'll see if it makes sense in the future, if there are like more pieces that I can open source, or maybe if I can find a way to open source the whole thing without jeopardizing the business model. Yeah, that was kind of the thought around it. The other like piece of it that went into the calculation was if I made it open source and like couldn't get paid to work on it full time, right? If like that wasn't enough money to make it a sustainable business, would it be better for the product and for its users to have it remain a side project, right? Something that, you know, got my attention whenever it happened, like whenever I had the time. Or would it be better for the product and for the users to be in a place where it was like, I can work on this full time and dedicate all of my energy to it?
So I guess I have two questions. You can take them in order or take them however you like. The first one is where does the paid product begin with ngrok 2? Because like I said before the break, I happily upgraded. Adam, I don't know which version you're running, but I wasn't taking advantage of any of the open sourcedness of it. I was just using it as a tool when I need it. And we're very casual users. I mean, like Adam said, we use it to expose a web server to campaign monitor so they can suck in some HTML, and I'll use it to develop a webhook here or there, you know, so we're very casual users. So tell us where the product, you know, the paid side, like what model you decided to go with in terms of the paid stuff that ngrok 2 has. And then as a follow-up to that, you know, if you will, give us some insight into how it's going and kind of the status of ngrok as a paid product.
So yeah, ngrok 2 still has like a very generous free tier, and most casual users never really break out of that free tier. And that's been something that I've been thinking about like over the past year is like, do I want to consider that lead gen, or do I want to actually take more things away from it that it incents people to upgrade? But you know, it's a difficult calculus. Like I don't want to cripple the product. Like I still want it to be like I still want that like really great initial user experience of like you download it and like run a command and like it's instantly working, and like there's no like please pay sort of thing immediately, right? That you like immediately get value out of it. So the major it's kind of all advanced features that people that are in the paid tiers today. So one of those is like end-to-end encryption is a thing that ngrok does that you can pay for, where instead of ngrok essentially like terminating your TLS traffic at its servers and then re-encrypting it as it transfers over the tunnel, that instead ngrok actually like inspects the incoming TLS connections and multiplexes those to your backend so that you can actually do end-to-end encryption, where ngrok is just a router essentially at that point on the internet. The one that kind of most people tend to upgrade for is custom domains. Is right now on the free version, you always get a random domain when you start ngrok. So allowing people to pick a custom subdomain of ngrok.io, or even being able to run a tunnel over their own domain name, right? So like dev.incontrivable.com is like
kind of white labeling it to a certain degree.
Yep, that's a paid part of the paid features as well, as well as like some additional like businessy stuff like IP whitelisting is another thing that's part of the paid tiers, things like that.
What's IP whitelisting do?
It basically lets you restrict the incoming connections to your tunnel endpoint to a certain set of IPs.
Gotcha.
Right.
Interesting.
So question 2, just how's it going? Like give us some insight into ngrok as a paid product. You also have Equinox. You can talk about that in light of like how are you doing it, making a business out of this.
So the great news is that ngrok is a sustainable business, which is nice. Awesome. Which means that I get to dedicate all of my time to it. which is really exciting. And it's why that it keeps getting better. Really, is that I actually have all of my time to devote to it. And as far as Equinox goes, the work on that is actually it's kind of work on ngrok in itself. Part of like
what is Equinox first?
Sorry, yeah. Equinox is, we talked earlier about the auto updating experience that ngrok has, where you can just like, it detects that there's a new version, you press Control U and it updates itself. So Equinox is all of that functionality around building a self-updating Go program packaged into a service for you. So it does that as well as like packaging and distribution. Like if you have a Go program, it will package it up to into an MSI for Windows and like a PKG installer for OS X, and like it creates a custom homebrew tab for you, so that when you release new versions, like you maintain all of those things. Equinox was kind of like built out of this desire to make the installation experience better, right? Sure, like there are a huge number of developers for whom you can hand them a zip and be like, here's the zip. It has a binary inside, like unzip it and run it. And that works for, a large majority of people, but ngrok's user base is huge. And it includes a lot of people who are not technical, like at all. People who have never used the command line before. And so being able to be useful to them means a better installation experience, a better updating experience, all of those things. So Equinox is kind of the work that's been put together to make that better. And so it's been packaged up as a separate thing with the hope that it'll be useful to other people.
Just looking at version 1 versus version 2, it seems like 1.0, the original open source version, wasn't what you wanted it to be in the long term. And now with 2.0, you're able to open up a web interface to it, obviously have custom domains, be able to look at traffic, things like that. I'm wondering if the web interface and the command line interface has a similar or mirrored experience.
Yeah, so that, like, all of those things were actually present in 1.0, actually. Like there was an introspection interface as part of version 1, and there was a website, like a dashboard for version 1 as well. It wasn't as, the website at least wasn't as fully featured as it is now, but there was one that existed. As far as them being mirrored,
well, I just mean, like, are they similar? Do they have similar features? Like, do you get more if you use the web interface versus the command line interface? Is there things that just maybe aren't present on either side?
I see. They're not really mirrors. There are a couple things that are in common there, but it's not like you can exclusively use the web interface to work with ngrok. If you want to start it, you do have to use the command line to start it.
Right.
But once it's running, you can kind of, if you want to look at the requests that are going over the tunnel, that's the only thing that's really mirrored, is like the status interface that you see in your terminal and that you see in the local web interface. Those are pretty much the same, except that the web interface is much more detailed because it just has a lot more screen real estate to work with. And, things like CSS and graphics, right?
Of course.
I have a hypothetical for you, and it's easy for me to say because it's your livelihood, not mine. But what do you think would happen if you took what you currently have, which is ngrok 2, as a product that's being both used for free by some people and paid for by some people, and you just took that and you didn't change anything in the model, but you just hit, open source on that repo? What do you imagine would be the fallout or the change from that dramatic, button click?
That's a really great question that I do not know the answer to. It's one of those. It's one of those questions that, like, here. I wish I knew the answer to that question.
Yeah.
And like, honestly, maybe one day, like, I will do that and I'll find out what the ansser to that question is.
Well, email us when you
really
do, and we'll have you come back on the show and talk about what happened.
Yeah. That'd be a really interesting experiment. and I'd love to run it. But that's kind of the unfortunate part, is it's one of those things where it's one of those experiments that you can't
really
undo
it.
Run, right? Yeah.
This probably is one of the first times, Jared, we've had somebody come on the show that started open source and went closed source, and is to a degree considering going back to open source.
Well,
Yeah.
insofar as I've asked him to.
Well, it sounded like earlier he was saying that too, like he was hoping that he could eventually potentially open source even the code, even though like paid features will be there. I mean, did I hear you wrong, Alan?
No, that's totally right. The goal is to find ways to open source parts of it. Maybe eventually the whole thing. Like, I've toyed around a long time with the idea of open sourcing just the client, which might be a thing that happens. Part of it might be actually taking just the protocol for actually like setting up the tunnel, and actually exposing that as like an open source piece as well, or finding ways to, I don't know, maybe experimenting with something like what SourceGraph has done, where they have their own kind of modified open source license, which still requires people to pay them for
it's a fair source, right?
The fair source license,
right. Biang, actually, speaking of SourceGraph, we're going to have Biang back on GoTime. We're going to record with Biang, but then it got rescheduled, so he hasn't come back on yet. But we mentioned GoTime before, and obviously Equinox and this isn't Go, but that's a really interesting example, because fair source, the license there was written, I think most licenses are written by lawyers, at least to some degree, but this one was actually written by a lawyer that's very familiar with open source and very involved in open source, that was trying to liberalize this license where it can actually provide the right kind of things that open source needs, but also the right kind of things a business needs, which is kind of interesting to think about that.
I'm really excited about those kinds of efforts. They're really exciting. I don't know how they're going to go, but I'm hoping for the best.
Fair source.
Well, if you're interested in that as a listener, I guess go to gotime.fm and hit subscribe.
Yes.
They'll be hearing about SourceGraph, and I'm sure they'll be talking about fair source on that show as well. Alan, let's get to our closing questions. Unfortunately, we're getting near the end of our time here. The first one we have for you, which is one of our favorites, is programming hero. So if you had to name somebody who's been a mentor or an inspiration or a hero of yours in programming, who would that be and why?
It's a hard question. There are so many programmers that I look up to and respect. One of the I guess more famous people that I've looked up to is that I guess I'm really impressed with is John Carmack. I don't know if you guys have read Masters of Doom or know too much about him, but
I have that in my Amazon wish list, but I have not. I haven't pulled the trigger on it yet.
Fantastic book. Really fascinating, especially if you're into video games or ever played Doom or want to know the history of id Software. But just a guy who is a technologist like through and through, and is not afraid to tackle problems that everyone else thinks are impossible, and is still doing it, right? I don't know if you read the story about him in Minecraft, about how he basically like got himself access to the Minecraft source code so that he could port it to Oculus, because he was dead set on it running on Oculus.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah, it was truly fascinating, right? And this is a guy who, like, man, he's been doing this for I don't even know how many years now, and is still like at the forefront of his industry, like leading it, and doing amazing things. So I don't know. He's definitely one of the people that I look up to.
Well, for those that listen to the show too, this is the 6th time that I can at least tell by our notes that John Carmack was a hero too.
Oh wow,
the big hero.
Yeah, that's interesting though, to think that he was that set on porting it over.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story too.
What, is there any licensing issues with that? Is that like legit? Is that a cool thing to do?
That was kind of the crazy part. At least in the article that I read about it, they basically said that Carmack's lawyers looked at the contract that they handed him and they were like, you're basically just doing this work for them for free. Like, you're not going to have any rights to it. And he was like, I don't care. Like, it just has to exist. Like, I'm so excited about this.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what came of it?
I'm not entirely sure. Like, I think they demoed it at some presentation, but I'm not sure where the status of that is right now.
So one other thing we like to ask Alan at the end of the show is radar. We have a weekly email we call Changelog Weekly. It's our editorialized take on our radar. And so when we have a guest on, we love to learn about your radar. So what's out there, whether it's a technology or open source, what's out there that if you had a free weekend, you'd play with it? Something you want to play with that you haven't had a chance yet?
I'm really excited about all of the emerging languages. So I'd probably be playing around with those. Like, I would be excited to try working with Rust some more, to try working with Nim or Elm or any of those sorts of things.
Rust, Mim? What's Mim?
Elm.
Okay.
Yeah. All of those kind of new and emerging languages that are approaching
Elixir?
Problems. Yeah, Elixir. They're all pretty exciting to me. So I'd take a look at those. Another thing, like, not in the language sphere, that I've been meaning to take a look at for, I don't know, maybe over a year now, is NixOS, as like a better way to do configuration management. The ethos around it is really appealing to me. So I'd like to spend some time actually like trying it out and seeing how well it worked.
I feel like we've heard of NixOS, Jared. Did we mention this recently, or sounds familiar?
I think it's you probably see it in Changelog Nightly a couple times. I've definitely heard of it, but we have not featured it in Weekly, nor have we done a show on it. So I think it's a good one for radar, because it's now it's just bubbled up again on ours.
All right.
Well, Alan, I think that's a close for a show. We would obviously love to talk to you more deeply about your fun trip down open source lane with ngrok. I mean, it's kind of interesting to see it start the way it did as open source, go closed, and potentially come back as maybe fair source. Who knows? But
I
guess if we can consider that open source, I guess it's kind of at least we're still out on that one.
It is still kind of, I mean,
it's in that gray area.
It depends on how you define open source, right? If it's
right.
Like I can see the code, then it's open source. If it's free open source, then I don't think it is, at least.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts from you before we close out? Anything you left unturned that you want to mention to the listening audience?
I mean, I just really want to thank you guys for having me on here. Like, it was just such a pleasure talking to you.
Cool, man.
So, like, thanks.
Yeah, man. We'll have to get you slotted on Go Time too, since you're such a Go fanatic, and you have to listen. GoTime.fm.
Yeah, I will definitely check it out. That sounds awesome.
All right, cool. And with that, that's the show. So let's say goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thanks, Alan, for the great tool.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for having me on.